screen. The New York State Department of Health has engaged the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research in collaboration with CTEC and MCTAC to provide training and technical assistance around the implementation of complex trauma within children's health homes. Complex trauma is a single qualifying condition for eligibility to be enrolled in a children's health home. New York State Department of Health, along with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and other stakeholders, developed several tools to determine a child's health home eligibility based on complex trauma. Today, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on the Complex Trauma Exposure Screen, or the CTES. Before we get started, I just want to take a quick moment to orient everyone to the WebEx system so you know how to participate in our event today. Please note that everyone is placed on mute to avoid any background noises. If you need help from anyone, you can click the raise hand button or chat to the host, whose name is Morgan. Her name is Caitlin, but it looks like Morgan on the screen. So she will be able to assist you. You will have the opportunity to submit questions for the Q&A portion of today, and we really encourage you to use a chat box feature to do that, which is located on the right-hand side. And you can chat at any time, and we'll be collecting questions to get to at the end of today's webinar. Thank you so much for being with us today, and our presenters are myself, Lydia Franco, Giselle Pardo, and Colette from DOH. Thank you so much, everyone, and we're going to get started. Here's our agenda today. So we're going to review trauma. We're going to review New York State complex trauma definition and as well as the workflow, which hopefully everyone is aware of by now, so it'll just be a review. We're going to also review the screen and take you through the screen and how to administer it, because our hope is that by the end of this webinar, if you weren't familiar with the screen, that you'll be very familiar and ready to utilize it. We're also going to review some best practices for completing the CTES. And we're going to talk about some challenges around completing it. So please chat in those questions along the way or any challenges as well, and then we'll get to those at the end. Just a little bit about the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research. We are housed at the New York University Silver School of Social Work. We are part of the school, and we are very committed to creating new knowledge about the root causes of poverty and developing evidence-based interventions to address its consequences, as well as rapidly translating research findings into action. So that's a little bit about what we do. And then this CTAC and MCTAC, we've been around for about 5.5 years. We're a training, consultation, and educational resource center and offer resources to all mental health and substance use disorder providers in New York State. MCTAC as well really offers training and intensive support on quality improvement strategies from business, organizational to clinical practices to really achieve the goal of preparing and assisting providers with a transition to Medicaid managed care. So I'm hoping that you've heard of us before, and this is just a reminder. Just as a reminder of our role at the McSilver Institute, that the New York State Department of Health has engaged us to provide training and technical assistance around the implementation of complex trauma within children's health homes. Trainings on the complex trauma exposure screen, as well as the complex trauma exposure assessment and determination and care planning are a part of our work together. This is our team, and so you'll be seeing or hearing from a variety of us throughout our time together, as many of you may already have done with our previous trainings. So I just want to dig in a little bit around complex trauma for New York State health homes serving children and what that means and what it looks like. And I want to begin by really focusing on trauma and what is trauma. And it's a word that we're all familiar with, right? Because the work we do really means that we probably encountered someone or many kids or children or families who have experienced trauma. But the way we think about it is that it's a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. Experiences are really emotionally painful and distressing and overwhelm a child's capacity to cope, creating a sense of powerlessness for the person or the child. So that those experiences really evoke fear, change the young person's worldview, and change the person's view of themselves. And then when we think about complex trauma and what this means, this describes an infant, child, or adolescent's exposure to multiple traumatic events and the wide-ranging long-term impact of this exposure. So sometimes children and teens may grow up with a lot of bad and hurtful things happening to them. There could be fighting at home, or children not getting enough attention, or may not have enough food to eat or clothing to wear, or may even be hurt by loved ones, or feel threatened or scared of them. Or they may even live in scary neighborhoods and feel constantly unsafe or see bad things even happen to people that they love. This is really what we are considering and thinking about in regards to complex trauma, and that these events are often severe and pervasive. They're initiated early in life, they disrupt healthy development, and they're interpersonal, so often occurring in the context of the child's relationship with a caregiver or a loved one. I just want to show you something that we've created for you, and all of these things are going to be available to you on our website after this training. They will be posted, and so you may have seen this, but if not, this is just a brief guide around complex trauma and the definition and the impact, as well as the tools and documents for complex trauma, the licensed professionals, and the determination for health homes. So this will be available for you. I also wanted to bring up this guide that was created so that I hope that everybody can see this. This is the guidance on complex trauma. So the New York State complex trauma definition was really approved by CMS with a collaboration of SAMHSA. Complex trauma is not a diagnosis, it is a determination, determined to assist with type of intervention and treatment that should be utilized. So this guidance on complex trauma really draws upon the domains within the definition of serious emotional disturbance, SED. So while there may be similarities in the conditions and symptoms that arise in either complex trauma or SED, the therapeutic approaches associated with the same diagnoses may vary significantly when the symptoms arising from those traumatic experiences are identified as such. Trauma experts who've been really guiding this process indicate that with complex trauma, the clinical diagnosis may be more severe and typically present as comorbidities or multiple diagnoses. So that's really important to remember. And then I want to just go in around and talk a little bit about the prevalence and the effects of trauma as well as complex trauma, because we know that trauma is unfortunately common, and as is complex trauma, and that a report, for example, a report of child abuse is made every 10 seconds. More than 2 million children in the United States are victims of physical and or sexual abuse. Children with disabilities, we know, according to research, are more likely to experience neglect than children without disabilities. And I don't know if many of you have heard about the ACE study. I'm sure that you have, which reports the effects of adverse experiences from childhood before the age of 18, and that it's very common, it's unfortunately common and have long-lasting effects. And so there's a document that it's actually a website. It's an infographic that you can learn a little more about ACEs. But it was found that if adults had experienced 4 or more of these ACEs, there are 10 that range from exposure to abuse or neglect and experiences of those things, even a caregiver in prison, then you were subjected to having a long-lasting effects as a result of that. And that's what this image really shows. And then it does have long-lasting effects. So children who experience abuse, neglect, are more likely to be arrested as a juvenile or to be arrested as an adult, so that it really, unfortunately, sets children up into a life of uncertainty. Trauma can deeply affect our bodies. For example, our nervous systems. It can cause depression, anxiety, behavior disorders, or other experiences. Trauma can also affect our relationships as well as our attachment. And when we think about young children on complex trauma and the effects of complex trauma, because young children really depend exclusively on their parents or caregivers for survival and protection, both physical and emotional, that you can imagine that those experiences have devastating effects. I'm now going to pass it on to Colette or Heather from DOH to talk about the workflow review.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. I was muted. So next slide. Great. So as Kara mentioned, we worked with a number of stakeholders across the health home program and also licensed professionals and those involved in involved with trauma, as well as the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, to develop how to implement the CMS-approved definition for health home of complex trauma. And so we worked collaboratively, and I know this chart may be a little confusing, but how to, because complex trauma is not a diagnosis, it's a determination, how could one make a referral to the health home program and then for the child to be enrolled based on the single qualifying condition of complex trauma? So this first flow chart really talks about those individuals who are not the licensed professionals in the community, so this referral phase. So whether you work at a school district or you're a care manager, you work into the community, you work with children, and you may think that they have been exposed to a lot of trauma, we have developed this, what this webinar is about is the complex trauma exposure screen. And so any layperson could complete this complex trauma exposure screen, and once positive on the screen, and Kara's going to be walking through that tool, a referral to the health home program can be made. And it just denotes at the bottom of this first yellow column that there are only certain individuals or groups that currently have access to the MAP referral portal or the health home referral portal. And so if you want to make a referral and you're not one of these entities here, then you can have contact with the health home program and a referral can be made. Once a referral is made because you're a positive screen on the exposure screen, which is, again, about this webinar, then we have a list of licensed professionals within the health home world that would then have to complete the exposure assessment and the functional impairment assessment to really make this determination of complex trauma, that the child meets the eligibility and the requirements that are outlined within the complex trauma definition. Once that licensed professional determines that the child meets complex trauma determination, then they would have to go through the process flow to then, in the grayish column, then be able to enroll the child within the health home program to obtain health home care management services, and then hopefully be linked, if not already linked, to appropriate care professionals that will assist them with this determination of complex trauma or any other diagnosis they may have as well. Next slide. So this slide is very similar. So this just identifies the scenario 2 workflow slide. Just really identifies that if there is already licensed professional working with the child, that a child can already maybe have a diagnosis, that they can also make a referral. It's not really necessary for the licensed professional who have access to these tools to complete the screening, but it may be helpful. And then, of course, the referral process would occur, and then the licensed professional would continue to work with the child to make the complex trauma determination to enroll the child in the health home program. So I just want to really highlight you know, for the health home program, there are currently kids being identified that would be appropriate for the health home program. And those children already probably meet the 2 chronic conditions or the single qualifying condition. They've already probably met with doctors because they have chronic medical conditions, or if they have seriously emotional disturbance with mental health, they may already have a licensed professional or counselor. And that allows them to be made a referral and possibly enrolled immediately. But due to the complex trauma definition not being a diagnosis and being a determination, and it really is a truly new concept to have this complex trauma definition linked to an eligibility program, there is a process to first determine whether or not the child through a screening may be eligible for complex trauma for the health home, and then has to go through an assessment process. So whether that child's already involved in treatment or with licensed professionals or they're not, they still have to go through this process to determine that they have the complex trauma and they meet the definition to then be enrolled in care management. And we're really working, and so is Silver McTech, really working with our health homes to identify who these licensed professionals will be to make these types of determinations so that children can be enrolled in the health home program. Next slide.
Thank you, Colette. We're now going to go over and review and administer with you the complex trauma exposure screen, and Giselle's going to take us through that.
Okay. Thank you, Kara. Okay. So if you can just pass over the ball. Okay, there we are. Okay. Okay, now we're ready to go. Okay, so just to quickly review again a lot of what was just mentioned in the workflow. Here is all the complex trauma final eligibility tools and documents that you would need to complete. Today's webinar is going to focus on the complex trauma exposure screen, which again can be completed by a non-licensed professional or a licensed professional. Once a child would screen positive, the next step would be to complete the complex trauma exposure assessment, and that form must be completed by a licensed professional. And that would be followed by the functional impairment assessment, which again needs to be completed by a licensed professional, and finally the complex trauma eligibility determination form, again, which needs to be completed by a licensed professional. So we wanted to take a quick look at the 3 E's of trauma. The assessment of complex trauma involves assessing the child's exposure to multiple or reoccurring traumatic events, as well as the wide-ranging and severe impact of this trauma exposure across domains of development. So the complex trauma exposure screen will really be looking at the traumatic events, what traumatic events a child may have experienced or been exposed to. The complex trauma assessment would really be looking at the child's experience of those events. And then the functional impairment assessment would look at the effects of this traumatic experience. So now we want to take you through the complex trauma screen itself. We're going to walk you through the whole screen, and then in a few slides we're actually going to go through some case examples to try to really practice using the screen and kind of bring it to life. Okay, so you should be able to see the complex trauma screen on your screen now, and there's a scroll button so you can scroll up and down. We're going to just quickly go through the instructions just because there's some key points that we want to make sure we remember as we're filling the screen out. So I'm just going to read it through with you. Please indicate whether the child experienced the following types of traumatic events. And so you'll see that there's about 10 different types of traumatic events listed on the screen, and then there's one last space where you could enter other if there's another traumatic event a child's experienced that's not listed. So we would want to assess if the child's experienced any of these traumatic events using all available information. So that may include a report that the child has already made to you, a caregiver report, if you have access to the child's records or charts. And we would conduct a brief interview with the child only if you do not already have enough information to make a determination about complex trauma exposure. To avoid undue distress, we want to ask only about the types of trauma for which we do not already have information. If information for a particular trauma is known, do not request additional details from the child for that type. So for example, if we already have information based on the child's charts that they've experienced physical neglect, we would endorse yes. and move on to the next category. Once the presence of 2 or more trauma types have been reported, or one lasting greater than 6 months, we can discontinue the screen, basically stopping there. So if I already have information based on from the child's chart that they've experienced physical neglect and attachment disruption, I would be stopping the screen at number 3 and not continuing. And then also important to make sure that we're checking off the sources of information that I use to complete the screen. So whether it's the parent caregiver report, the rec report from the child, or access to chart or records, or other. So as you'll see, the first type of traumatic event is physical or emotional neglect or emotional maltreatment. That's followed by displacement, attachment disruption. If the child has experienced any form of sexual abuse or sexual assault, if the child has experienced any form of physical abuse, if they have experienced and been exposed to domestic violence. The next category is if they've experienced community violence or interpersonal violence, so that being someone has assaulted them, physically beaten them up, or threatened to physically assault them. The next category is bullying, followed by has the child or anyone in their family been involved in or in direct danger from a terrorist attack, war, or political violence. And the next form of a traumatic event would be the experience of either being stalked or kidnapping. And then at the end, you will see that there is space for filling out other trauma. Again, we would need to only indicate if the child has experienced 2 traumatic events or one that has lasted more than 6 months. Okay. So now we just want to, why am I not? Okay, thank you. Sorry, I was having a technical difficulty there for a moment. So now we just want to quickly review some best practices for completing the complex trauma exposure screen. First, talking about best practices if we're completing it without interviewing the child. So again, ideally we want to be able to complete the screen based on the knowledge we already have about the child, the knowledge or the information we may have in the child's records or charts, and not interview the child. If I'm working with a child and I believe that they've experienced complex trauma, I can complete that complex trauma screen on behalf of the child. And again, go through all the available sources I have before asking the child or family any questions on the screen. We want to make sure that we discontinue the screen once we have 2 items. Once we've endorsed 2 items, so in other words, the child has experienced 2 traumatic events or one that has lasted longer than 6 months. Then once I've completed this screen and the child has screened positive, if they've screened positive, I want to have a conversation with the family about the results of the screen, what the next steps would be in terms of making a health home referral, and the next steps of completing the complex trauma exposure assessment. Oh, there we go. So then next we just wanted to go over best practices for completing the screen with an interview. So this would be in the case that I don't have enough information to complete the screen and that I would need to speak with either the caregiver, the child, or both. So we'd want to have a conversation with the family about completing the screen and about the referral process. And we'd want to try to gather as much information as possible about the child first before interviewing them. And then talk to the family about what the screen's about, what's the purpose of it, what kind of questions I may be asking. Ensure that there's no immediate safety concern for the child, and then really create a sense of safety for the family. Making sure that we're going through confidentiality, that I'm checking in to see how they're managing, addressing these questions, and if they're visibly distressed, stopping, asking for permission to go on to the next question. And so remember, we we don't want details of the exact experience. We just want to get a yes or no about whether they've been experienced a particular type of trauma and the length of time, and discontinuing the screen and discontinuing the interview once I've had 2 items or 1 item that has lasted longer than 6 months. And at the end of completing the screen, again, we would have a conversation with the family about the results on the screen, the referral process to the health home, and the next step of completing the complex trauma exposure assessment. Okay. This slide is just re-emphasizing kind of what's been said repeatedly, but important to remember about trying to complete this complex trauma exposure screen with the information we have in order to avoid undue distress to the child. Okay. So next we wanted to go through a case example. We're going to read through the case example and then together try to complete the screen. So we're going to start with a case example of Stephen. And Stephen is a 3-year-old boy who currently lives with his mother and 7-year-old brother. Mom brings him to the pediatric clinic due to concerns that he's not eating well and not sleeping through the night. Mother discloses that there has been a recent change at home. Stephen's father, who has lived in the home since Stephen's birth, is no longer living with them due to domestic violence. Mother has obtained an order of protection, and the father was ordered by the court to move out of the home about a month ago. The father has petitioned for visitations with his children and will start next week. So now we want to go through the screen and see if Stephen would screen positive for complex trauma. So we'll kind of go through the screen together. So based on the information I have from Mom, at this point, I don't have information and don't know if he's experienced any physical or emotional neglect. And I don't have information if there's been any displacement. However, based on what Mom has said, there does seem to be attachment disruption, since Dad had been living with Stephen since his birth and now is no longer in the home. However, this was only a month ago, so it's a yes, but not greater than 6 months. There is no information or report at this point of any sexual abuse or any physical abuse, but there is information that there has been domestic violence, so that Stephen has been exposed to domestic violence, and that's a yes. I would gather from the mom, I would ask the mom about how long this has been going on, but at this point I would have 2 items on the screen, and I could stop the screen at this point. We're going to move on to another case example.
Yeah, so we're going to cover a couple more, and I just wanted to reiterate then sort of the next step would be referral to the health home for further assessment and completion of the CTEA and the functional impairment rating. So let's go through another one. We have at least 2 more. And feel free to sort of chat in if you have any questions, if anything stands out to you as kind of confusing or you're not sure where things fit. Use that chat box on the bottom right and make sure to send to all panelists so we can see your comment and your feedback. So here we have Jeremy. Jeremy is a 7-year-old boy who lives with his grandmother in kinship care. Jeremy has been in and out of mental health treatment for several years. He was first referred to treatment by the school when he was in pre-K. Jeremy's mother is living on the street and is currently homeless and last reported by a grandmother who's addicted to heroin. Jeremy has been living with his grandma since he was 2. Jeremy is currently in 1st grade and reportedly being bullied by some older students after school. So does he screen positive for a complex trauma? So we go back to the screen, and sort of what we can see is there are a couple things that kind of stand out. And let me just go back to the scenario real quick just to highlight. So one is that he's been in kinship care for a number of years. So there's we can go back to the screen and see that that probably fits under attachment disruption because he moved from, it sounds like, living with his mother to his grandmother for a number of years. And then what we have here is that the second sort of main thing is that he has been bullied. He's currently in first grade and reportedly being bullied by older students. Now, we don't know how long that bullying has happened, but that for this case, because he's already sort of we've already endorsed one traumatic event, what we have is now endorsement of 2 traumatic events, even if we're not clear around the timing. The one thing that I also wanted to highlight here is that this is really solely endorsing whether something occurred. We don't need to go into additional detail about what happened, or, you know, we don't need to know the specifics of the disruption or the mother's history. We don't need to know so many details around the bullying. All we need to know, yes or no, did something occur and for how long, if needed. The other thing that I want to highlight is that there's no qualification here in terms of whether that experience, so like living with grandma, we're not also sort of evaluating whether that has been a negative experience for him, moving from mom to grandma. That's not part of the screen. So here we're solely talking about complex trauma exposure screen and yes, no, whether an event happened. The additional details will be covered by the licensed professional when they do the assessment. So for Jeremy's case, we would say yes, he screens in for attachment disruption and bullying, and then we would refer him to the health home for further assessment. Well, let's go through one more, and this one may not be as clear. So we have Sophia. Sophia is a 15-year-old girl. She has recently entered treatment as a high school guidance counselor recommends she sees someone for her continued absences and low moods. Sophia's parents are divorced and she lives with her mother. She does not know her father as he was in prison when her mother was pregnant with her, and she has not had any contact with him throughout her life. She heard he had been released but not in contact with anyone in her family. Sophia's mother also cares for her 8-year-old brother who was born with spina bifida. So the main thing right now is that obviously you have a teenage girl, 15-year-old girl, who's having some mood issues and some difficulty in school with absences. You know that the parents are divorced, that she doesn't know her father because he's been incarcerated. There may be a question about him and her relationship with him now or not, since he's been released, and that there's this other concern at the home around the brother and maybe stressors around that. So if you go back to the complex trauma screen, as you go through, it's unclear at this point whether they actually screen in for any of these trauma types. So there's a potential there for attachment disruption, but if she never really had contact with her father, then that's sort of a question mark for me, right? The stress or her mood issues is not necessarily considered a traumatic event, right? And then the other information that we have was about the brother and the mother taking care of the brother with an illness, and again, that's not necessarily considered a traumatic event for the child. So this is an instance where it's a little unclear of a case, and that if you do feel that they may meet eligibility, that this is an opportunity where you would gather some additional information. And so this is a 15-year-old girl. One option is to talk with the girl directly and clarify if any of these events have occurred. Other option is also to incorporate the mother in the conversation, as had been outlined previously around best practices. Being mindful that they may not screen in this case. However, that is not to say that they wouldn't necessarily be health home eligible, because they could screen in based on the other eligibility criteria for health home, but maybe not complex trauma. So this is one of those cases where you need additional information. So based on those examples, you know, I do encourage you to kind of chat in. We're getting a couple sort of questions coming in, and we're going to try to attend to those shortly around completing the screen. I do want to highlight a couple key points, that the screen, the complex trauma exposure screen, is only for children who may have experienced complex trauma. Not all children need to be screened for complex trauma. They may be eligible for health homes under one of the other eligibility criteria. If the designated licensed professional for complex trauma plans to complete the CTES, so that's the full exposure assessment on the child, the that licensed professional does not necessarily need to complete the screen. So essentially, if it's a licensed professional that would complete the screen, that licensed professional is also eligible to just complete the assessment and not do the screen. The screen is necessary when it's not a licensed professional completing it. And just, before we move on to some chats and some questions that are coming in, because we do want to spend some time on that and clarifying any additional points, we just wanted to highlight this sort of key point here, which is anyone who interacts with a child who has experienced any kind of trauma, including complex trauma in their home, school, and community, can make important contributions to healing and growth. So that this is really an opportunity to be able to attend to a significant issue in a lot of the children's lives that we serve, and so that we hope that this being able to assess and provide services specifically about complex trauma will lead to significant support and improvement for a lot of the families that we work with. Okay, so we've done a lot of talking, and we want to kind of really open up the chat to answer any questions that you may have. And so what we'd like to hear also is if you've already completed the screen with a child or family, and how did that go? I know so some of you may not have utilized this already. Some of you, we believe, already have been utilizing it. So it would be great if you could share what that experience has been, and if there's any specific challenges that you've come across that you'd like to share with us. So we have one question. So it's more, a couple questions are coming in, but please also let us know if you've had a specific experience already in completing a screen with a family, because we'd also like to hear about that. And so if the referent is a licensed professional working in trauma treatment, can that person do the complex trauma assessment? So yes. So if it's a licensed professional, they can go ahead and do the complex trauma assessment along with the functional impairment assessment for the health home eligibility criteria. You don't necessarily have to do screening. Screening is primarily completed by a person who may not be a licensed professional. So if you're thinking about other providers, a primary care provider, a school counselor, other people that may be interacting with that child, they could do the screen and then refer to the health home or licensed professional to complete the rest of the assessment. Let's see. And feel free, again, use that chat box on the bottom right. Make sure that you hit send to all panelists so that we see some of the questions and comments that are coming in.
So this is Kalaisi, a question here surrounding that a referral can be made when the screen is complete, and that is correct. But the question here is, can the child be enrolled in a house home? So no. The screening alone that we just went over does not get you enrolled. As I mentioned through the workflow, the screening is to help to identify a child that potentially meets the complex trauma definition. So this tool, as was outlined today, is once you have identified two, then or one chronic, I would say, or long-lasting, you can make that referral to the health home. But it's not until the licensed professional, the clinician, completes the assessment and the determination that the child meets complex trauma that the child can be enrolled. And then the other question I see here is about the licensed professional being part of the health home, and whether or not there has to be some barrier or something regarding conflict of interest or conflict-free. So that is correct. So I apologize if I misspoke or it was misunderstood. So we are working with our health homes to identify community providers that are clinicians and licensed professionals who may be able to assist health home care management agencies to complete these assessments in a timely manner. There is an opportunity that, there's large agencies out there that do a number of great things. They may have numerous programs, and one of the programs may be Health Home. So a licensed professional or clinician can work with the same agency. They just can't be in the Health Home program. They can't be a care manager or someone that supervises care managers that determines whether a child has complex trauma as well as enrolling them at the same time. So they can be employed by the agency as long as they're not part of the Health Home program or in the community like other providers. So that is what we are trying to do with our Health Homes, is really identify who those community providers are that could help the Health Homes complete these assessments so that children can be enrolled in the Health Home program.
Thanks, Colette. I just want to chime in really quickly. Somebody was asking about licensed professionals, so I'm inserting a link into the chat box so that everybody can see the list of licensed professionals, and I'll go over those just to remind everyone. Licensed Master Social Worker, LMSW, Licensed Clinical Social Worker, LCSW, Licensed Psychologist, Licensed Psychiatrist, Licensed Psychiatrist Nurse Practitioner, Licensed Marriage and Family Therapist, Licensed Mental Health Counselor, Pediatrician or Family Medicine Physician, or Internist with specialization in behavioral health. So that was one of the questions that came up that I think is really important to also answer. So I did send in, there are a list of documents at www.health.ny.gov/healthcare, Medicaid. So if you go to ny.gov, then you'll see Health Homes, and you can click on Health Homes, and there are a list of very helpful documents there. And I'm sure you all know this, but just as a reminder. There's some other questions coming in. Can managed care companies perform the CTES? So can managed care companies perform this complex trauma exposure screen? Colette, could you answer that one?
All right, it takes me a minute to get unmuted. So absolutely, a managed care company or plan can look at their membership, and they can determine and complete the screen and make a referral to the Health Home. They can also, a lot of managed care plans are working with the lead Health Home. They can work with the lead Health Home to maybe complete that, but they would have the information. So if they have the information based on the services the child has had, they are able, so really anybody who, works with children can complete the screen. We do have to remember, however, that if you complete the screen without an interview, as outlined in this webinar, that once you've reached the 2 items or the 1 long-lasting, you can't make a referral to the Health Home program without talking to the parent legal guardian and letting them know about the Health Home program and asking permission to make a referral to the program. So it's really important, as we outlined here, is regardless of whether you do the screen with or without an interview, it's really important to include the family, explain what the Health Home program is, explain why you think the child is eligible potentially for a Health Home, and that you would like to make a referral. So I just want to really highlight that this is not, people just filling out paperwork and making referrals. It's really important that there's connectivity, because we want the licensed clinician as well as the Health Home care manager to really work with that family to help get them enrolled. And we don't want them being cold called to people's homes, so we're more successful when we're working with families and we already know them. And then we are doing handoffs, or we're explaining who might be coming out to their home.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's a question here, just to be clear, when we make the referrals into MAP, they should be placed in an outreach segment. Is this correct?
Okay, so there's rules around the outreach. So yes, the only option when a referral is made to care management agencies to accept them and either enroll them or put them in an outreach segment. So you would put them in an outreach segment. Whether or not you bill for services in outreach or enrollment depends on whether or not you're following the other rules surrounding the health home program. So absolutely a referral would be made because the screen would be complete and there would be indication that the child might be that the child is positive for complex trauma on the screening tool, but you've yet to know if they're eligible for the health home program to enroll them. So you, as a care manager, will make sure that they have that connectivity if they're already not connected to that licensed professional to complete the assessment and functional limitation assessment to be able to enroll them after that determination is made.
Thank you, Colette. We have a really important question here. What if the child is eligible based on the other criteria, but also may have experienced complex trauma? Is it still, oh shoot, I lost the question. Is it still recommended to complete the screen with the child? And I think your answer would be absolutely. So I know, Colette, you said in the past, if somebody, you know, may be suicidal, would we investigate that? And it's, you know, that sounds dramatic, but it really is somewhat similar in regards to if a child has experienced complex trauma and we know all the devastating effects in regards to that, we absolutely should do the screen. Would you agree, Colette?
Yes, absolutely. So, you know, we hear this question a lot. So if a child already meets the eligibility for the health home program, let's not delay, right? Let's enroll them, make the referral and enroll them to not delay care management services. But at any time during care management services, if other professionals that are working with the children, when you do the multidisciplinary team meeting, or you as a care management or health home, you know, you can do the screening. And, you know, the purpose of that is, you know we work with so many children that will probably need the complex trauma determination. And what we want to do is really get them the right treatment and services, right? So there's a lot of kids that may meet the eligibility criteria to be enrolled in a health home, but they may not be in the right services, or the service providers may not know that they have a lot of trauma. And again, some of the work we'll be doing later with Tag Silver is to really talk about that care planning. And, you know, it's really important, the approach, and I know many have trauma-informed care training. The approach you take, or the approach that a clinician will take with a child, may be drastically different if they also know that the child will have complex trauma. So it's really important. And if the trauma screening comes in with the referral as well as them, as well as the child meeting the other criteria, as was just talked about, if you have a screening tool that indicates that somebody may have another condition or another need, it's absolutely mandatory to follow up on that, right? So again, it may take a little work, but as long as you can enroll that child under those other conditions, we should always follow up on any type of screening tool or indication that the child has another need.
Thank you. And to follow up on that question, we had a question come in asking, I'm wondering if there's been any discussion regarding the steps towards the identification of complex trauma and determination of complex trauma as being cumbersome, and therefore pushing people toward an easier alternative for enrollment by identifying, for example, an SED diagnosis. And what's your recommendations?
So as I mentioned in the workflow, we totally understand that because, you know, the health home program for children is very young. We're only like 7 months old, so that's what I tell people. And there's lots of children out there that people are already working with that probably already have a diagnosis or chronic conditions, medical conditions that would be eligible for a health home. That means they're, you know, they're already working with professionals and they may already have those diagnoses. So, you know, that's a little easier because they already come to your attention with that eligibility already for you, right? A psychological has already done, a medical workup with a pediatrician has been done, maybe they're already in services, you know, they're getting cancer treatment, whatever the issue, that's coming to you. So it may seem like complex trauma is a little cumbersome, but right now we also have to remember that for New York State, we are the first state to have approval for this definition. So we really had to build the infrastructure by building these tools, and now we have to find the right people in our communities to be able to assess. Hopefully, as we continue with this program of Health Home and we continue to educate the community out there about complex trauma, hopefully other professionals will continue, as we work with children, incorporate trauma and complex trauma assessments along with their other assessments, and then hopefully it won't be as cumbersome. But yes, this does bring on a little different pathway than current referrals care managers may receive, because when you're making a referral, you already believe and you already know the child has those diagnoses or those conditions, and you already probably have some type of proof or validation of that. Where with complex trauma, you're starting with a screening. So I think it will change over time. Just like, you know, 10 years ago, you didn't really hear about trauma-informed care, but now there's so many providers out there that, you know, that's how they now service children, with this trauma-informed care lens. And so we really just need to start educating folks, and I think this is great for the field and for helping children, but really talking about complex trauma and then talking about what types of intervention and treatment would be very beneficial for children that are also, you know, have other conditions as well as complex trauma. So we do know there's another layer, there's another step. There's probably a time problem between the screening and the assessments, because as I mentioned, we're still identifying professionals that can do all of these assessments. So, but I do, you know, I just want people to know, you know, it's a process, we're working on it, it will take time to educate folks, but it's very new, and we're the first state leading the way, so we're going to have to see what bumps in the road occur. And I would like to also say that the Department of Health is very willing to hear feedback about the tool. You know, if the tools aren't working for people, then, you know, we will, you know, look with our stakeholder group to see if there's something else we need to do. Anything that we change, we do have to go back to the federal government, CMS, because these tools are all approved along with the definition from them.
Thank you, Colette. I just want to reiterate that I'm very appreciative that DOH is taking this on. I think it's really important as a social worker in the field for so many years, knowing that children were having these experiences and not fully, and they weren't always getting the best treatment. So thank you. I just want to highlight that. And I have one more question before we move on, because it's almost time to wrap up. Someone asked, is this a tool for teachers to use regarding the CTES? Is this a tool for teachers to use, or should they refer out to the guidance counselor or school psychologist? And what is the difference between this screen and the ACE screen? So the same person asked these two questions. I don't know if you want to answer one or both.
I can answer the first one. I'll let you deal with the second one. Absolutely, a teacher can fill this out, you know, and I know there are procedures with schools, so if they feel the guidance counselor may have more information or have the child's record, they can definitely do that, but we know there's lots of teachers that are very involved with students and families and know a lot of information. So if they feel comfortable filling out the screening tool and it has that information, that is totally appropriate.
Thank you. And I don't know that I can fully answer your question around all the differences between this and the ACE screen, because it is very similar, but it is broken up into different categories, and there are more nuances around it. So they are similar in regards to assessing abuse and, you know, neglect and displacement and detachment, but there are nuances around this. So thank you.
Yes.
I think these are some really wonderful questions. I'm wondering if maybe we should create an FAQ from this webinar, and then we could submit the answers to everyone, because there were also a lot of questions we didn't get to. Would that be okay?
Yeah, I think that's great. I just want to also say the difference between the ACEs and this screening is very specific to the definition of complex trauma, so it's a very narrow lens. So I just want to put that out there compared to the ACEs. And yeah, I think that's a great idea. We can put an FAQ together regarding this and have it on you guys' website.
Fantastic, thank you. So we're going to move on and wrap up, and then we will send out an FAQ to everyone who participated in the webinar, as well as post on our website. So these are our next steps. We are encouraging agencies to complete the Health Home Serving Children Community Provider Complex Trauma Survey. So this is really a scan to get a sense of those licensed professionals who can complete the assessment as well as the treatment. And so there's this is going around. Hopefully you've seen it. If not, you will see it today. I also wanted to let everyone know that we have upcoming in-person trainings on the Complex Trauma Exposure Assessment. They're going to be offered in 3 different locations, one July 7th in New York City, one July 14th in Albany, the other July 17th in Rochester, and those will be from 9:30 to 12:30, and we will be sending out the announcement later today so that you can register for those. We'll also have a complex trauma networking webinar that will be coming up in late July or early August. If you have any questions or concerns, as a reminder, here's our email address and our website where everything can be found, ctecny.org/complextrauma. If you have any questions, you can email them to us at hhcomplextrauma.info@nyu.edu, and then they included DOH's address if you have any questions for them, or I can also send out, Colette, I didn't know whose email to give in regards to if people have questions directly for you. Would they email you, or is there or should we just pass on the questions to you from us?
You can pass on the questions. I think most people who've been on our webinars know our Health Home Serving Children mailbox is hhsc@health.newyork.gov.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. And then these are just some resources we have for you in regards to complex trauma and the definition, as well as the exposure screen, and then some information around the assessment. So thank you again for joining us, everyone. We hope that you really have a deeper understanding of the complex trauma exposure screen. And please join us in our in-person trainings for the complex trauma exposure assessment in July. We hope you have a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing or talking to you soon. Colette, did you have any last words?
No, thank you. I hope this helped, and appreciate McSilver McTack joining and partnering with us to help develop these excellent trainings for folks to get a better understanding of the process and the tool.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.